Picture this, a perfect day, sunny weather, music playing, a happy couple exchanging vows, but suddenly, sirens, police, everything changes in an instant. Now ask yourself, what could go wrong? A neighbor, driven by hatred and fear, decided that something wrong was happening at this wedding and called the police, but what they saw on the scene shocked them. Before we continue this story, stop for a minute and share with us in the comments, what is your name and where are you watching this video from? Your comments and support are so important to us. Each of you helps us grow our channel, and we truly appreciate each viewer. Without you, none of this would be possible, and you are our main motivator. Thank you for being with us. Now let's go back to the moment when the officers came closer and enjoy watching. Mr. Wilson had lived in the area for many years. He was the type of man who never missed an opportunity to point out anything that seemed wrong. At first, it was little things, noisy neighbors, trash in the street, children who played too loudly, but one particular grievance stood out in particular, his dislike of people of other races, especially black people. As the years went by, this hatred only grew stronger, and Wilson made no secret of his disgust. Every time he saw a black person in his neighborhood, his insides began to boil. He watched them with suspicion, as if their every move was a threat to his peaceful life. He was convinced that such people simply could not be proper, could not behave decently like their white neighbors. To him, they were strangers, whom he did not want around, even if they behaved perfectly. In his eyes they would always remain outsiders, uninvited guests in the world that he considered his own. Wilson was open about this to his loved ones. He proudly told them how he distrusted people like that, how he considered them criminals or lazy. Every time a new black person appeared on his radar, he suspected the worst: theft, violence, drug dealing. He saw them as a threat to his order and safety. His racist views were deeply ingrained in his consciousness, and he saw nothing wrong with them. It was natural to him. His parents had lived that way, and he had lived that way. Over time, Wilson's dislike began to grow into outright hatred. He began to closely monitor all black residents and visitors to the area, writing down their license plates, the time of their arrival and departure. He was sure that one day he would catch them doing something illegal. With each passing day, his suspicions grew, and even those who were just passing by seemed to him to be criminals waiting to do harm. When he learned that one of the couples getting married was black, Wilson's rage boiled up inside him. He couldn't imagine that such people would dare to hold a celebration in his neighborhood. To him, it was not only unacceptable, it was offensive. He felt that it violated the very essence of what a good neighborhood should be. And then the day of the wedding arrived. He stood at the window, watching the preparations. The music played, the people laughed, and Wilson sensed a hidden agenda in their every move. He couldn't take it anymore. Gritting his teeth in anger, he picked up the phone and dialed the police. "There's something wrong here," he said. "I'm sure there's something illegal going on. You need to come right away." Mr. Wilson had always been an observer of his neighbors. His windows gave him a clear view of the street, and he watched daily, assessing how everyone was behaving. The day he noticed movement on the property next door, his anxiety immediately grew. A black couple who had recently moved in began to prepare something. At first, it was just boxes and tents being delivered, but when decorations and chairs began appearing on the lawn, Wilson felt anxiety growing into anger. "What are they doing?" he muttered, standing by the window and clenching his fists. "A wedding? Here? In my neighborhood?" He had long regarded the couple with disdain, considering them something of a stain on the good neighborhood in which he had lived for years. Wilson believed that such people could not belong in a society that he believed was built on decency and purity. He was sure that people of another race, especially blacks, could not afford to live in such a place by honest means. He had only one picture in his mind: they were either criminals or simply out of place. As the first guests began to arrive, some of whom were black, Wilson couldn't help but smile wryly. He moved closer to the window, trying to get a good look at each face, catching the slightest hint of suspicion. "Look at this," he said out loud, to himself. "A yard full of them. I wouldn't be surprised if some of them were already wanted." He abruptly opened the window to better hear what was happening outside. The sounds of laughter and music only made him even more angry. Wilson pressed his lips together, wondering how something like this could happen so close to his home. These people, he believed, were destroying the peace and order of his life. In his eyes, they had no right to be happy here. To this holiday, to Joy. He was starting to get angrier and angrier. "They've got a real circus going on here," he muttered. "This is no place for such events. They can't possibly make any money from such celebrations legally." With each new guest who arrived, Wilson felt his bias deepen. He began to look for the slightest infractions: someone parking too close to his lot, someone laughing loudly. In his fevered mind, these little things became signs that something illegal was about to happen. He was sure there were drugs involved, or, as he liked to say, some criminal dealings. Wilson, heated with rage, convinced himself that he simply had to intervene. Images of crimes that he believed were about to happen were already appearing in his head. He was sure that these people were hiding something. "They just can't be what they seem," he hissed, fiddling with the phone in his hand. "It's only a matter of time before the truth comes out." His mind was spinning with thoughts about how he could rid his area of these people, how he could restore peace by destroying this threat to the purity of the area. Finally, his patience snapped when he saw a group of young men start laughing and having fun near the tent. "That's it," he barked, dialing the police. "I'm not going to wait for them to ruin this area completely." 911. "How can we help you?" The operator's calm voice rang out. "You have to come right away," Wilson began, breathing hard with anger. "There's something fishy going on here. They're throwing a wedding, but I'm sure it's a cover for something much bigger. These people, they're not from our area, and I don't believe this is legal." "What exactly is suspicious going on?" the dispatcher asked calmly. "There are too many of them, and they act like they can get away with anything. They park their cars all over the place, they laugh loudly, and I'm sure they have drugs. I just know it." There was desperation in his voice, as if he was the only one who understood the seriousness of the threat. Wilson glanced at the group of guests standing outside the tent, seemingly enjoying the moment. But to him, it was a picture of the immorality that was invading his normal routine. "I just can't stand this," he breathed into the phone. "You have to do something." Putting down the phone, he went to the window again and felt his heart beating faster and faster. An ideal picture had already formed in his head. The police would arrive, start checking documents, disperse this crazy holiday, and he, as a hero, would rid his neighborhood of those who don't deserve to be here. Mr. Wilson stood at the window, his heart pounding with excitement. He continued to watch the cheerful bustle in a neighboring yard, where a black couple was preparing for a wedding. Everything he saw only fueled his hatred and suspicion. In his mind, everything that might be normal for other people faded into the background. At first, it was envy of their laughter, of the joy they radiated, but then this envy turned to hatred. "How can they afford this?" he thought, fiddling with the phone in his hands. "People of their race can't live in a neighborhood like this and throw such parties. This is definitely a scam." Wilson was convinced that something illegal was going on here. He felt that if a black couple could pull off a wedding like this, they must have stolen money or used drugs to finance the day. It wasn't just his thoughts, it was a deeply ingrained belief that people of other races would always resort to deception and trickery to get ahead. There was no room in his mind for any other option. He remembered how often his parents had talked about people like that and how they had always compared them to normal people, meaning white people. They had taught him mistrust and hatred, and now those lessons bubbled to the surface like stinking bubbles in dirty water. Gritting his teeth, he finally made up his mind. The problem with blacks was not only personal, but also social. How could he allow these illegal elements to destroy the order in his neighborhood? Was he really going to have to tolerate this outrage? "This isn't just a wedding," he said out loud, trying to convince himself. "This is a cover for something worse." Gathering his wits, he dialed the police number, as if the call would be his personal weapon against what he considered a threat. The call rang out in the quiet of his home, each beep echoing in his chest like the anticipation of battle. 911. "How can we help you?" the dispatcher's calm voice rang out. Wilson swallowed, trying to sound convincing. "I want to report suspicious activity at a wedding next door. I watched a black couple get ready for the party. They are putting up tents, and there are too many of them. This is clearly some kind of cover for illegal activities. I am sure they can't afford to do this legally." "Why do you think so?" the dispatcher asked, surprise evident in her voice. "People of their race don't usually live in such nice neighborhoods," Wilson blurted out, his voice shaking with indignation. "I just know there's something fishy behind this. Look at them, they look like they don't know how to behave in society." He froze, trying to read the dispatcher's reaction, but her calmness only added fuel to the fire. Do you have any concrete evidence to support your suspicions? Evidence? He barked. I can see that they are simply acting suspiciously. Who stages a wedding in such numbers for no reason? And believe me, if you saw how they act, you would understand. Wilson continued to speak, anger and prejudice building in every word. He tried to convince the dispatcher that his fears were valid. All those stereotypes he had accumulated over the years were pouring out, turning into accusations that made even him uncomfortable. They could be drug criminals, and I don't want this to affect our neighborhood. Please send someone to check before something terrible happens. When he hung up the phone, his heart was pounding with excitement. He felt that his actions would have consequences, but at the same time, a sense of triumph was building in his mind. He had done what he had to do, protected his home, his neighborhood, from a threat. It was only a matter of time before the police arrived and confirmed his suspicions. They shouldn't be here, he thought, watching the cheerful crowd. I won't let them ruin this place. As the police car drove past, lights flashing, Mr. Wilson's heart began to beat faster with excitement and triumph. He could already picture the police quickly exposing the black couple and their suspicious guests, breaking up their party and bringing peace back to his neighborhood. This was his chance to be a hero, and he wasn't going to waste it. The police pulled up at the edge of his property, and two officers got out. One was tall and burly, with short hair. The other was shorter and thinner, with a kind smile but a wary look. Wilson hurried toward them, feeling confidence fill his chest. "Thank God you're here," he exclaimed, without even waiting for them to say hello. "You have no idea what's going on here. They're having a party, but it's not just a wedding. I'm sure they're doing something illegal." The officers exchanged puzzled glances, but seemed willing to listen. "What exactly is it that makes you suspicious?" the thin officer asked, squinting to get a better view of the crowd of guests on the neighboring property. "They're all black," Wilson blurted out. "And look at them. They're laughing, acting like they have no rules. No one could legally organize a wedding like that in our neighborhood. I assure you, there's something more sinister going on." The officers exchanged glances again, and though their expressions remained calm, Wilson felt a cloud gathering over him. The thought flashed before his eyes. What if they don't believe me? What if I'm wrong? The thin officer, apparently trying to avoid conflict, said, "We just want to talk to them and find out what's going on." But Wilson wasn't going to stop. He pointed to a white tent surrounded by cheerful people who were unaware of the tense atmosphere around them. "You don't understand," he insisted, feeling his anger rising. "These people could be dangerous. I've lived here for years and I know what it's like. They're breaking the law, and I'll prove it to you." The officers began to approach the tent and the excitement grew. Wilson felt his confidence begin to crumble. He looked at the smiling faces of the guests and his heart sank. What if they are right? What if this is just an ordinary wedding? The thought filled his head, but he was not about to give up. As the officers approached the group, there was laughter and cheering, as well as pleasant music. The officers began to chat with the invitees, and soon one of them, with a smile on his face, turned to Wilson. "It's all right, sir. There's no violation here. People are just celebrating a wedding." "Mr." Wilson's insides stirred. He couldn't believe his ears. "What?" he barked, as if the question were his last hope. "You can't take this seriously. They all look suspicious, and they have too many people. I just know something's wrong here." The officer shook his head, and a look of sympathy appeared on his face, but he remained friendly. "We cannot interfere with private events unless there is clear evidence of wrongdoing. Just rest assured that we will investigate the situation." Wilson felt fear wash over him. He had been waiting for the police to confirm his suspicions, and now they seemed to be ignoring him completely. His inner conflict grew with each passing minute. Maybe I'm wrong? What if they really are just celebrating? But at the same time, anger was bubbling inside him, making him feel like a traitor to his ideas. He stood up, overcome with fear and rage. There was no longer any doubt in his mind. He had to do something to get the situation back under control. How could he let them go like that? As the officers approached the tent, the bright lights from the lanterns flickered through the fabric, casting rainbow-like reflections on the guests' faces. The laughter and music seemed to wash over them like a wave, but in reality the tension was mounting. The officers exchanged glances, realizing that this could be a potentially dangerous situation. At that moment, the bride and groom approached them, noticing the police officers. The groom, tall and muscular, was dressed in a formal tuxedo, his face glowing with joy. The bride, in a chic white dress, looked at her groom with a gentle smile, while her hair fluttered in the wind. This picture, full of love and happiness, contradicted what Wilson expected to see. The police, not yet understanding the true situation, locked eyes with the couple. The groom, slightly tense, stepped forward, ready to explain what was happening, but the officer's eyes were already filled with stereotypes formed by their life experiences and prejudices. "Do you have documents?" asked one of the policemen, his voice stern. The groom, feeling his heart pounding, pulled out his ID. "It's all right, officer. We're just celebrating our wedding," he tried to explain, but his confidence was slipping with every word. "We're not breaking any laws." The officer glanced quickly at the bride, and disbelief flashed in his eyes. At that moment, Wilson, watching from afar, felt his prejudice only deepen. "Surely they can't be normal," he thought. "How could they possibly organize a wedding in this area?" The bride, noticing the policeman's wary gaze, offered her hand to the groom, as if trying to bolster his confidence. She was a refined woman, with delicate features, but now fear lit up her eyes with alarm. "All we want is to celebrate our day," she said, her voice full of hope and a little trepidation. "We have no intention of breaking the law." Meanwhile, the police officers, continuing to exchange glances, began asking additional questions. "How did you get the money for the wedding?" asked the thin officer, clenching his fists almost imperceptibly. This phrase struck the groom. He frowned, feeling a wave of anger rising. He understood that these questions did not come from curiosity, but from a bias in which he was being assessed not as a person, but as a stereotype. "We worked hard to make this day special," he replied, trying to contain his emotions. "I'm an engineer and my fiancée is a nurse. We both worked hard to raise money for this wedding." But the groom's words didn't seem to impress the police. Their gazes were still full of distrust. In the eyes of Wilson, who was standing to the side, they looked like people trying to hide their true intentions. "We don't want any trouble here," the thin officer added, inquiring about the guests. "If you have any suspicious people, you'd better tell us." The phrase fell on the bride and groom like a thunderclap. Excitement and fear began to squeeze their hearts, as if they had become the object of an interrogation instead of being happy participants in their own celebration. The bride, feeling the tension, glanced sharply at the groom. "We don't have any suspicious people," she exclaimed, her voice shaking with stress. "We just invited our friends and family to celebrate our love." The officers seemed unmoved. Their expressions were impenetrable, expressing only sternness, and they did not notice how the guests around them were watching the situation with alarm. Silence fell over the tent, and the sounds of celebration suddenly died down as people began to realize what was happening. Fear slowly filled the atmosphere. At this point, Wilson, still watching from afar, felt his vengeful thoughts clouding his common sense. He thought he was defending his home, but now he began to realize that it wasn't just his neighbors who were in danger. This couple had become victims of his hatred and prejudice, and this realization seemed to weigh on him, but he didn't want to admit it. Meanwhile, the tension in the tent was growing. The officers continued to ask questions, and the bride and groom, while sincerely trying to explain the situation, felt their joy and happiness slowly slipping away, leaving only fear and confusion. The tension in the tent was growing, and every moment spent in the company of the police officers seemed like an eternity for the bride and groom. The officers continued to ask questions, their tone becoming more aggressive and derogatory. The groom felt not only fear but also anger growing inside him. "You didn't just arrange this wedding for nothing, did you?" one of the policemen said doubtfully, interrupting their attempts to explain. "Someone is probably behind this to cover up their real intentions." The officer's words sounded like thunder in the silence. His displeasure was obvious. The bride, standing next to him, felt her heart squeeze with humiliation. "We just love each other," she whispered, trying to maintain her dignity. "This wedding was our dream." But the officer, not paying attention to her words, continued to ask persistent questions. "How did you manage to pay for all these expenses? It's not common in your circle to spend such sums on holidays," he continued, crossing his arms over his chest. His voice was filled with disdain and distrust. The groom felt anger begin to boil inside him. How could anyone question their work and the effort they had put into getting to this day? He tried to remain calm despite the derogatory words. "We've worked together for many years," he said, trying to sound confident. "I'm an engineer. My fiancée is a nurse. We've both been successful in life and we're able to save enough money for this wedding." But his answer only added fuel to the fire. The officer laughed sarcastically. "An engineer? A nurse? And all this at your age? Do you really think we believe your fairy tales? It looks like you're just trying to justify yourself." The comment was like a punch to the gut. The bride tried to hold back her tears, but the policeman's words pierced her heart. "We're not trying to deceive anyone," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "This is just our life, and we're here to celebrate our love. Please trust us." But the policemen just winked at each other, as if they were part of some twisted show. The skinny officer turned to his partner. "Just look at them. Isn't it funny how they try to look normal? Nowadays, such representatives usually hide under the cover of night." The policeman's words hit the groom like a whip. His eyes flared with rage. He knew this situation wasn't just about his wedding. It was about how he was being judged as a person. How could they say that when they were just trying to have a party? "We are not representatives," he barked, unable to contain himself. "We are ordinary people, just like you. We should not be humiliated for who we are." But the police didn't react to his anger. Instead, they just chuckled, continuing to mock the situation. "Let's talk about your friends," the aggressive officer continued, turning to the crowd standing to the side. "Who are they? Why are so many people here? This looks like an unlawful assembly. You're not going to break the law in our area, are you?" Every word he spoke was filled with disdain and distrust. The bride and groom exchanged glances full of fear and despair. They felt the atmosphere around them becoming more and more hostile, as if all their dreams and hopes were being destroyed before their eyes. The groom, feeling humiliated, decided to say what was tormenting his soul. "This isn't just a wedding. This is a celebration of love," he said, trying to get the message across to the officers. "We're not breaking the law. We're here with our loved ones, and we don't deserve to be treated like this." But his words only increased the police's ridicule. "Love? Seriously? In your mind, love may exist, but let's face it, you just want to throw a party to hide your true intentions. Someone needs to check what's going on here." At that moment, fear gripped the groom. He realized that all this could end badly, but the internal humiliation and anger were stronger. How could they judge their happiness so cruelly? How could they ignore all their efforts, everything they had built? The crowd watched the scene in tense silence. They too felt humiliated as they watched their beloved couple become victims of an aggressive interrogation, full of bias and hatred. The bride and groom, despite all the insults, continued to hold their heads high. They knew that their love was more important than any humiliation, and that one day this fear and prejudice would be conquered. But at the moment, they felt completely defenseless under the pressure of hatred that surrounded them. As the police began questioning, the wedding guests in the tent felt the joy and happiness evaporate in an instant. Their laughter and dancing turned to panic and shocked looks. Despair filled the space as people began to realize what was happening. Some guests, unprepared for such an aggressive intervention, began to whisper among themselves, looking at the bride and groom, who now stood under the weight of prejudice and ridicule. The faces of friends and relatives were distorted with fear and bewilderment. "What's going on? Why are the police here?" one of the bride's aunts asked, her voice shaking with anxiety. "It's just a wedding," another guest exclaimed, trying to calm the others. "They shouldn't behave like that." But her words could not ease the tension. The guests, who had witnessed the humiliation, began to realize that their beloved couple had become victims of something far more sinister. The bride and groom looked confused and tearful, their happiness and dreams crumbling under the pressure of the hatred that had permeated so strongly in that moment. While some guests tried to calm each other down, others started taking out their phones to record what was happening. The screams, alarm and indignation grew louder and louder until someone exclaimed, "Why don't you leave? It's just a wedding." The crowd began to disperse to the edges, and people began filming the scene, capturing moments of humiliation and prejudice that made no sense. They saw police officers judging their friends and family, and it was angering and upsetting. "Yes, it's not just a wedding," one of the policemen said with a grin, watching the crowd, as if they enjoyed seeing the confused faces of the people. "It's a gathering of people like them. Here in our area, your couple just wants to hide their true intentions." The words rolled through the tent like a wave. Whispers of discontent began to form in the crowd, and the anger of some spectators began to grow into open indignation. "You have no right to treat them like this," one of the guests shouted, thrusting his fist forward. "We are here to celebrate love. not to watch you humiliate people, but this only spurred the police aggression. Who are you to question our actions? One of the officers said, his voice menacing. This may be a legal gathering, but we will check to make sure there is nothing suspicious. At this point, fear gripped not only the bride and groom, but all the guests as well. They understood that their celebration had become an arena of prejudice and racism, and none of them were immune from the threat. One of the bridesmaids, sobbing hysterically, approached the police. "Please, just go away. It's just a wedding. You shouldn't be here." Her words sounded hopeless, and her voice broke with despair. But instead of responding to her requests, the police officers just grinned, clearly enjoying the situation they found themselves in. "What are you saying? It won't work anyway," said the skinny officer, continuing to press the bride and groom. "Maybe we should check everyone here. Who knows what's going on at this wedding?" Meanwhile, some guests began filming the scene on their phones, capturing the humiliation and fear that had gripped the wedding party. One of the bridesmaids took a video of the bride crying and the groom clenching his fists. The footage became a symbol of how bias can ruin happy moments. The laughter and joy that once filled the tent were now replaced by hatred, shocked looks, and fear. Guests witnessed racism in action, realizing that even in moments of happiness, they were not immune to aggression and prejudice from those who were supposed to protect their rights and safety. The bride and groom, full of disappointment and bitterness, looked at their friends and family, sincerely hoping that the support and love they felt would help them through this horror. But at that moment, they realized that their dream of a beautiful wedding had turned into a nightmare full of humiliation and racism. As the tension in the tent reached a breaking point, Wilson, the neighbor who had started it all, stood to the side with a smug grin on his face. He watched the proceedings with obvious pleasure, as if this horrific moment were his own personal triumph. His eyes blazed as he began shouting insults at the newlyweds and their guests. "Look at them," he shouted, over the whispers and cheers from the guests. "Look at how they try to look decent, but still remain who they are. It's not normal that people like you even decide to get married." Every word he spoke sounded like a weapon meant to strike, and with every shout he only added fuel to the fire. The guests, hearing this, felt the anger rise in them. Their hearts were filled with hatred and a desire to protect their friends, but at the same time they understood that Wilson was using this situation for his own benefit. "You are laughing here. This is not a wedding, but a disgrace," he continued, looking at the bride and groom as if they were his personal targets. "Everyone knows that your happy moments have no value. In your area, such weddings only happen to cover up vile deeds." Each word he spoke cut like a blade, leaving no chance for defense. The groom, feeling the rage boiling in his chest, clenched his fists, but knew that any reaction would only make the situation worse. The bride, her face clouded with tears, held his hand tightly, trying to convey her support, but Wilson's words permeated the atmosphere of hatred, leaving them defenseless. "If you only knew how all the normal people laugh at you," Wilson continued, his voice growing louder. "It's just a disgrace. Do you think that your love can change people's opinion of you? Naive." The crowd of guests, despite their fear, began to openly express their discontent. "Go away, Wilson. You have no right to talk like that," one of the groom's friends shouted, his voice full of anger. "You're only jealous of their happiness." But Wilson just smirked in response, enjoying the conflict. "Envy? No, I just can't look at this hypocrisy," he said with a poisonous grin. "You all disgrace yourselves with this happiness and love. No wedding can cover up your true faces." The cries of discontent among the guests grew louder, but this only fueled the neighbor's hatred. He continued to shout insults, as if this was his only purpose at the party. There was a cruel joy in his words, and this caused more and more excitement and fear in everyone present. "You just don't understand that all this is just a theater for people like you," he shouted, pointing at the guests. "You're nothing more than clowns in this zoo, and your stupid smiles won't change the fact that everyone hates you." William, one of the groom's best friends, couldn't take it anymore. "You old fool should know that we are not here for you. We are here to support our friends, and you are only trying to sow hatred and prejudice." As always, these words only increased Wilson's rage, and he paused for a moment, collecting his thoughts. "Oh, look at him," he exclaimed contemptuously, pointing at William. "He's the typical representative who will always stand up for you. just to show how diversity can become a laughing matter in the eyes of normal people. Wilson's words were infuriating and hateful, but they also revealed the unbearable reality that the bride and groom were facing. Each of his attacks was a painful attempt to destroy their happiness, and at the same time, they became a symbol of the inhumanity that existed in their surroundings. At that moment, the groom, deciding that he could not stand it any longer, stepped forward, but in his voice there was not only rage, but also tenderness, full of pain. "We won't let you ruin our day, Wilson. We love each other, and no one, not even you, can change that." But Wilson only chuckled, as if his words were nothing more than a whisper on the wind. "Your love, it means nothing in a world where you will be hated," he said, his voice full of venom. "You will not change this world, and your dreams will remain just dreams." And in that moment, amidst all the hatred and prejudice, the bride and groom realized that their love might be the strongest, but they had to be prepared to fight the hatred that had already filled the tent. Their day was turning into a fight for their rights, their dreams, and their lives, but that was only the beginning of what they were about to experience. The situation in the tent was becoming increasingly tense with each passing second. The police, feeling their power and supported by their neighbors' hatred, began to act more and more aggressively. They strode forward, looking at the guests with condemnation, their faces stony and indifferent to the suffering they were causing. "Get away from them," one of the officers shouted, pushing one of the groom's friends in the shoulder as he tried to protect the couple. "You have no right to interfere in our business." The guests began to panic as officers began to physically restrain some of them, twisting their arms and pushing them against the walls. This show of force added to the fear in the atmosphere, and everyone felt like they were on the edge of unbearable. "Don't you dare touch them," one of the bride's aunts screamed, her voice full of despair, but her words only made the police even angrier. "Nothing we do concerns you," one of the officers replied through clenched teeth, looking at her tear-stained face. "You should be grateful that we are here to maintain order." The couple at the center of all this hatred felt the pressure mounting. The groom tried to remain calm, but inside he was seething with rage. He knew that if he didn't intervene, the situation would only get worse. "We're not doing anything wrong," he said to the police, his voice shaking with tension. "We're just celebrating our love." But his words only caused the officers to smile contemptuously. "Love?" one of them repeated, raising his eyebrows. "This is not love. This is shame. You have no place here." The officer's words served as a catalyst for further escalation. The hatred Wilson had stoked was reflected in the police's actions, and in their eyes they viewed the guests as criminals rather than people who had come to celebrate an important moment in their friends' lives. While some guests tried to offer support to the couple, others began to take their loved ones away from the police, fearing that one or another guest might be among those physically detained. This fear became increasingly palpable. "Get your hands off him," one of the bridesmaids cried, trying to pull her friend out of the policeman's grip, but her efforts only resulted in the officer grabbing her wrist and pulling her roughly toward him. "Please let me go. I just want to help," she screamed, experiencing physical pain and psychological horror. "You should know that your help is not needed here," the other policeman said with disdain, holding her shoulder. "Stay away from these two, or you'll get more than you can handle." The words sounded like a threat, and it increased the fear that gripped everyone in the tent. The guests began to realize that they were actually trapped, surrounded by prejudice and hatred that they could not ignore. Some began to purse their lips and look at each other nervously, not knowing what to do. Wilson took advantage of the moment to start shouting more insults. "Look at how they look now. The police don't beat up innocent people, only those who behave suspiciously. You're all just a bunch of spawn. You don't belong here." This outburst caused more shouts among the guests, and some began to protest. "We are not criminals. We are just celebrating a wedding." Voices were heard, full of anger and pain, but the police just kept pushing, starting to detain more people, ignoring all cries for help. Confusion and panic reigned all around, and everyone felt more and more vulnerable. "We will not let you tear our family apart," the groom said, his voice shaking with rage. "We will not let you and your racism destroy our love." But these words only fueled the hatred. The police continued to cast looks of disdain and roll their eyes when they heard these protests. "Your family," one of the officers chuckled. "It's just a false word to cover up your true self." Screams and hysteria filled the tent, and every insult, every humiliation only made the situation worse. Fear and hatred mixed in this terrible cocktail. and nothing seemed to be able to stop this whirlwind of prejudice and violence. At this point, it was clear that the conflict was just beginning, and no one knew how it would end. The situation in the tent reached a critical point when the police began to block all exits. Their actions became more and more aggressive and oppressive, and soon the guests realized that they could no longer leave this place. Each of them became a suspect, simply because they came to celebrate the wedding of a black couple. The police looked at them with disdain, and their harsh gaze penetrated the souls of the guests, causing a feeling of humiliation. "We must make sure there are no lawbreakers here," one of the officers declared, his voice full of self-satisfaction. He looked sadly at the faces of the bride and groom, as if they were guilty. Every word spoken by the police officers cut the air, filling the tent with an atmosphere of fear and tension. The guests began to look at each other, feeling defenseless and vulnerable as never before. Some began to panic, while others tried to calm each other down, but their efforts were in vain. "That's impossible. We just came to a wedding," said one of the bridesmaids, her voice shaking with fear. But the policeman just smirked, ignoring her words, and said, "Everyone here looks suspicious, and until we figure it out, you better stay put." Despite their fear, the guests began to rise from their seats, but were immediately stopped rudely. One of the policemen grabbed the young man by the shoulder, abruptly forcing him back to his seat. "I said stay where you are," the officer shouted, his face contorted with rage. The guests, who had been celebrating and enjoying themselves at the beginning, now felt trapped, and an unbearable atmosphere of fear hung in the air. The neighbors' hatred, which had fueled the conflict, became more and more obvious with each passing moment. "You think anyone's waiting for you here?" Wilson said, standing to the side and watching with a smirk as the guests became victims of police aggression. "No one wants to see you, so stay where you belong." Every word he said was like a blow, and he enjoyed it. The guests felt themselves being humiliated, their dignity being destroyed before their eyes, and they could do nothing about it. "We're not criminals, we're just friends and family celebrating love," one of the men shouted, his voice filled with despair and anger. But his words were ignored, and the police officers seemed to only smirk in response. They began to form a circle that made the guests feel like wild animals cornered. Everyone present knew they were trapped in a hatred that grew with each passing moment. The police weren't just blocking the exits, they were blocking their ability to breathe, to rejoice, to laugh. This wasn't just a wedding, it was a battle for their dignity and their right to exist. The cries and protests of the guests became more and more desperate, and the police officers just continued to ignore them. Their faces remained impassive, as if they did not see the fear and humiliation that filled the tent. "We're here to maintain order, and no one leaves until we sort this situation out," one of the officers shouted, as if it were an excuse for their violence. And at that moment, the guests realized that they could no longer sit idly by. The bride and groom, seeing their loved ones suffering, decided it was time to intervene. "We will not remain silent," the groom shouted, looking into the eyes of the officers, full of determination. "You have no right to humiliate us." But this time the police reacted sharply. One of them, clenching his fists, stepped closer to him, and his threatening expression indicated that they were ready for physical aggression. "Oh, you want to show us your rights?" the officer said, his voice full of mockery. "Well, then we'll just show you what's going to happen to you if you continue." At that moment, fear enveloped the tent, and the guests realized that they now had to choose, give in to hatred or fight for their truth, even if it cost them everything. The atmosphere in the tent was extremely tense as the police continued to press the guests, forming a circle around the newlyweds. However, soon there was a sense of impending change in the air. The bride and groom, determined to defend their love and dignity, began to fight against the pressure and humiliation. "We're not going to be silent," the bride cried, her voice firm despite her fear. "We have a right to our own wedding, and you have no right to treat us like this." These words caused a slight confusion among the policemen who had just been enjoying their power and anger. One of the officers, a senior officer, squinted, trying to study the couple's faces, as if there was something familiar about them. "Stop," he said, his voice less confident. You're not who you say you are." At that moment, the tension in the tent rose to its limit, and the guests' eyes filled with hope. They realized that this might be their only chance to change the situation. The bride and groom exchanged glances, and there was understanding in them. They knew that if their true identity was revealed, it could dramatically change the attitude of the police. "Do you know who we are?" the groom asked, his voice a little calmer, but there was still a hint of anger in it. "We know," the senior officer replied, his face growing a little pale as he began to remember. You seem to hold high positions in society?" "Yes," the bride answered proudly, her voice a loud slap into the silence. "We both work for charities and help people in our community. We came to celebrate our love, not to be victims of racist stereotypes and police violence." At that moment, the police officers looked at each other and silence fell in the air. The guests began to raise their heads, filled with hope. The sullen faces of the police officers suddenly acquired a note of confusion and uncertainty. They clearly did not expect that the couple they considered suspicious were in fact respected members of the community. But that doesn't change the facts. One of the policemen tried to object, although his voice sounded less confident. "You're still breaking the law." "Breaking the law?" the groom interrupted. "You're violating our rights. You're using your power to bully and humiliate people based on preconceived stereotypes." The atmosphere in the tent suddenly changed. The police, who had been so sure of their rightness, began to realize that their actions could have consequences. The guests, who had been depressed and scared, began to feel a surge of confidence and support. "We have a right to defend ourselves," the bride added, her voice now full of determination. "We will not allow you to insult us and our love." However, the senior officer, still not wanting to admit his mistake, said, "Yes, you may be respected members of society, but that does not mean that your actions cannot arouse suspicion." These words filled the tent with tension again. The bride, feeling her heart pounding, took a step forward. "We didn't come here to ask for your forgiveness. We just wanted to celebrate our love with our friends and loved ones. You must understand that racism has no place in our society, and your job is to protect people, not to humiliate them." The bride's words filled the space, and in that moment she realized that despite all the hatred and prejudice they had experienced, she and her groom had the power to create change. It was their time to speak out against oppression, and they could no longer remain silent. But despite this, the senior officer was still not ready to accept what was happening. He turned to his subordinate and commanded, "Take them away. We still need to check their documents." The words sounded like a loud blow, and panic again gripped the guests. They did not believe that the situation could escalate again. The bride, realizing that their future depended on her next step, looked at her groom one last time and, full of determination, said, "We will not submit to this hatred. We will fight for truth and justice, and we will never allow you to humiliate us or our community." These words became a catalyst for change in the tent. Guests, encouraged by her courage, began to rise from their seats, uniting and supporting each other in this critical moment. Now they were ready to stand up to racism and bias, knowing that even in their darkest hour they could find the light within themselves and each other. The situation in the tent became tense as the bride and groom's words began to make it clear to the police officers how wrong they had been in assessing the situation. But instead of admitting their mistake and apologizing sincerely, the officers began to show signs of awkwardness and embarrassment. The senior officer, realizing that he was holding the responsibility for inciting hatred and creating conflicts in his hands, hesitated. The confidence with which he had made the accusations had dissipated, and now he stood as if cornered, under the gaze of all present. Okay, he said, his voice shaking. We were just doing our job. We got a call and had to respond." But his words sounded strained and unconvincing. The guests began to whisper among themselves, their discontent only growing. They were not ready to accept excuses that had no basis in reality. "You weren't just doing your job," one of the groom's relatives snapped, his voice thick with rage. "You used your power to humiliate us. You relied on racist stereotypes to justify your actions." The senior officer, realizing that his words were not being supported, tried to redirect attention. "We understand what's going on now. We didn't mean to offend anyone." But this time his voice sounded even more uncertain. The guests, crushed by the country of prejudice, began to gather around, expressing their discontent. In their eyes one could read not only indignation, but also a determination to defend their dignity. "If you really understood, you wouldn't humiliate us," the bride said, her voice full of dignity. "You're just looking for an excuse for your hypocrisy. You haven't shown an ounce of respect for us as people." The words hit home. The officers realized that their actions, their disregard for human dignity and their bias, had exposed all the flaws in the system they represented, but instead of a sincere apology, there was an awkwardness in the air. "We just wanted to get it sorted out," the other officer said, sounding tired. "We didn't know who you were. You could have just come up and asked," the bridesmaid interjected, her voice full of anger. "Couldn't you just act like normal people?" The police looked at each other, confusion in their eyes. They seemed unsure how to respond to the growing discontent. Instead of trying to restore trust, they only looked more frightened and isolated. The senior officer tried to say again, but didn't know what to add. Instead of dealing with the situation and apologizing, they began to retreat, which only increased the sense of hypocrisy. The police officers stood there as if waiting for the conflict to resolve itself, not realizing that they were the ones who started it. Meanwhile, the guests, supported by each other, began to express their feelings. They began to discuss their impressions of how they had been humiliated and insulted. "We came here to celebrate our love, not to be victims of racism," one guest said, her voice shaking with emotion. "We don't need your apologies if they don't come from the heart." Gradually, the anger that had accumulated in the guests' hearts began to sound louder, and the senior officer realized that they had lost control of the situation. They could not simply leave without admitting their guilt, but they could not do so for fear of the consequences of their actions. He said again, but couldn't finish the sentence. The guests continued to insist on their own, and the pressure on the police increased. They understood that they would have to face the consequences of their actions, and fear began to penetrate their hearts. The neighbor standing aside also noticed how the situation was developing against him. He watched with a grin, but in his heart there was a growing fear. He did not know what public opinion would be when this situation came to light. At this point, it became clear that the police were incapable of solving the problem. They had only made it worse, and now they would have to deal with the consequences of their bias. The guests, full of determination, continued to fight for their rights, and this was the beginning of their journey to justice. The neighbor, standing to the side and watching the tension grow in the tent, could not believe his eyes at first. He had not expected that the couple he had so confidently deemed unacceptable would actually be respected members of society. His mind swung between shock and stubbornness, as if he were trying to hold on to his true nature as everything around him began to crumble. He rubbed his hands, cursing himself for allowing his preconceived notions to take hold of him. But despite the internal struggle, the old, familiar anger was rising in his heart. "This is all a fake," he whispered to himself. "They're just trying to use their connections to throw us off guard." The neighbor stepped forward, confidently embracing his racist stance. He began shouting from behind the police officers, trying to regain control of the situation. "Look at them," he shouted, pointing at the newlyweds. "Don't be fooled. They are trying to cover up their criminal actions using their high positions. You all see it, don't you? It's just a trick to avoid responsibility." His voice was arrogant and the words flowed like poison, fueling hatred and prejudice. He continued, "They can't be good people if they're going to celebrate something like a wedding while their eyes are burning with hatred for normal people. It's all a show." The guests began to whisper, the discontent growing. They looked at their neighbor with disdain, realizing that his words were full not only of hatred, but also of fear. He was afraid of losing his power and control over his surroundings, and this made him furious. The neighbor continued, "Police, you must do your job. Stop this disgrace before they deceive us all. They should not be here." The neighbor's shouts filled the air, and each of his attacks only fueled the guests' anger. The bride, feeling the adrenaline boiling in her veins, stepped forward, ready to confront this hypocrisy. "It's none of your business," she screamed, her voice full of rage. "We're here to celebrate our love, not to spew out our hatred." The neighbor, feeling the challenge, straightened his shoulders again, as if this gave him more strength. "Love?" he mocked. "Do you think that your love is more important than common sense? You do not belong here. Your vile ideas and your manners are simply not acceptable here." His words were full of arrogance, and he continued, oblivious to the negative reactions his insults were causing. "I knew you weren't real. You just want to trick people to get what you don't deserve." The tension was mounting, and at this point it became obvious that his neighbor was not going to change his mind. Despite clear evidence to the contrary, his racist views had clouded his mind, and he could not imagine that his ideology could be wrong. while the police continued to waver between the desire to maintain order and a sense of confusion. The neighbor distanced himself from the group to try to find support among his like-minded people who, unfortunately for him, were also unable to give up their hatred. He did not realize that with every minute he spent in that tent, his influence and respect among his neighbors were weakening. He thought that his prejudice and hatred were justified, but in fact he was only deepening the gulf that separated him from true human dignity. The neighbor stood there, surrounded by his darkness, unaware that the world around him was changing. He continued to argue, even when his words were not supported. This was not just an argument, it was a reflection of his inner fear, which forced him to continue to fight even when he had no arguments left. The guests, increasingly overwhelmed by the atmosphere of hatred and fear, were in a state of extreme tension. A real battle was taking place around them, a battle for their rights, for their humanity and dignity. Although some tried to remain calm, the tension grew, and soon they could no longer contain their emotions. One of the groom's uncles, a man with a strong build and character, could not stand it. "This is simply absurd. We are not here to become victims of racism." His voice was loud and confident, attracting the attention of those around him. "You, the police, are obliged to protect us, and not to succumb to bias." The police officers standing at the exit looked at him with bewilderment. Their confidence was beginning to crumble. One of the officers, clearly nervous, tried to answer, "We're just checking the situation. We've been informed of suspicious activity." "Suspicious activity?" Another guest interrupted, younger, with striking features and an aggressive gaze. "Do you really believe this is suspicious? Can't you see that there's a party going on here? You should be on our side." The atmosphere grew tense. Guests began to gather in groups, supporting each other. Each person, realizing that they were not alone, was ready to speak out against the tyranny. Negative emotions began to break out, and excitement engulfed the crowd. The bride and groom stood holding hands and watched as their guests began to confront the police. They had many questions, and their hearts fluttered with pride for those who were ready to defend their right to happiness. "How can you treat people like this just because they're a different color?" one of the bridesmaids shouted. Her voice was full of indignation, and she pointed at her neighbor, who was continuing to shout from afar. "It's his fault that you're behaving like this. He's the one who called you out for no reason." The policemen began to exchange nervous glances. The tension between them and the guests was becoming increasingly obvious. It was felt that there was a chasm of misunderstanding between them, and every glance or gesture could cause a new wave of conflict. "We're just doing our job," one of the officers tried to say again, but his voice sounded uncertain. The guests responded with only disdainful looks. Some began filming the event on their phones, their eyes full of shock and anger. The neighbor's words about suspicious activity sounded absurd and disgusting. The guests were not going to allow their wedding to become an arena for racist outrage. The situation was heating up, and soon several guests began to openly confront the police. Shouts, accusations and threats filled the air. Fear took hold of everyone, and it seemed that anyone could break this growing tension at any moment. "You have no right to detain us," shouted another guest, clenching his fists. "We are here to celebrate life, not to suffer from your prejudice." The bride, encouraged by the support of her friends, stood up and looked resolutely at the police officers. Her eyes shone with determination. She was not going to give up. "You think you can just tell us what to do?" she asked proudly. "We are people, and we deserve respect. We came here to celebrate, not to be your victims." Her words delighted the guests, and they began to raise their voices in support of her. Their unity only increased the atmosphere of conflict. They could no longer hold back, and each new cry became part of this struggle for the right to be heard. The police, sensing the growing tension, began exchanging confused glances. They were unsure how to respond to the open confrontation, especially when some of the guests began approaching them, shouting accusations of racism and bias. The neighbor, watching this chaos, felt his confidence begin to crack at the seams. Inner doubts began to undermine his stubbornness, but he continued to stand his ground, trying to prove that he was right. His words and actions only increased the hatred, and he seemed ready to go to the end, even if it meant even more humiliation for everyone. At this point it became clear that the conflict had reached a critical point and that only inevitable escalation lay ahead. The situation in the tent became tense. The police, feeling that control was slipping away from them, began to take more severe measures. The guests, united by anger and passion, we're not going to give in, and this only added fuel to the fire. If you don't calm down, we'll be forced to arrest you, one of the officers shouted, irritation evident on his face. His words caused a wave of indignation among the guests. Arrest us for standing up for our rights? The groom's uncle shouted. Do you even understand what you're saying? We're celebrating here, not breaking the law. Some guests began to protest openly, pointing at the police officers as if trying to condemn their behavior. This is just racism, one of the men shouted. You come here and humiliate us just because we're black? You must be crazy. In response, the police began to single out their suspects. They eyed the guests as if looking for a convenient pretext for an arrest, and soon one of the officers, clearly overcome with emotion, approached a group of 3 black men. You 3, he shouted, you're causing too much trouble. Do you have any identification? Come on, show them. The men exchanged puzzled glances. One of them, noticing that this was clearly a biased behavior, responded defiantly, why are you asking us? We are not criminals, and we do not need to justify ourselves to you. But this only fueled the police's anger. Seeing the disobedience, they began to threaten arrests. We are not joking. If you do not calm down, we will arrest everyone who does not obey, shouted another policeman, and his voice sounded menacing. The situation was getting worse and the tension was growing with each passing second. The guests began to realize that any move they made could lead to inevitable consequences. Their hearts were pounding with fear, but they were not going to give up. You have no right to do this, one of the women cried, trying to hold back her tears. We are not here to experience your hatred. We just want to celebrate love. But her words only fueled the hatred of her neighbors, who began shouting racist insults again. The neighbor, losing control, began shouting again, adding fuel to the fire. This is just a show, he shouted. Don't let them fool you. They don't belong in our society. Do you really want people like them to be part of your celebration? The police, increasing the pressure, began to approach the guests. Their faces expressed confidence that they could do anything without fear of consequences. If you don't calm down, we'll have to use force, one of the policemen warned, his words hanging in the air like a threat. Some guests began to retreat, fearing possible arrest, while others, on the contrary, showed even greater courage. One of the men, standing in the foreground, raised his fist in the air and shouted, "We will not tolerate your oppression. You have no right to threaten us just because we are black." This caused a storm of cheers among the other guests, and they began to gather around him, creating a front against oppression. Everyone felt that the fight was not only for their rights, but for the dignity of black people in society. The police, seeing the tension growing, began to act more aggressively. They began to move forward, pointing at those who were protesting the loudest. You better calm down, otherwise we will be forced to disperse you by force, one of the officers said menacingly, his eyes flashing and his voice sounding like a sentence. The crowd began to shake with fear, but instead of retreating, the guests rallied even more, realizing that this was their only chance to confront racism and prejudice. The situation was critical, and any moment could lead to a new outbreak of conflict. The situation at the wedding had reached a critical point, and the tension in the air was almost palpable. Meanwhile, one of the guests, standing at the edge of the crowd with a phone in his hand, realized that now was the time to get some outside support. He began filming the event, and his video quickly spread across social media, attracting attention. "I can't believe this is happening," he muttered, knowing his recordings could help bring the truth to light. "We have to show that this isn't normal." With each new frame of his video, the number of viewers grew. News of the wedding nightmare soon spread throughout the city, and soon several reporters began to descend on the scene. Their camera and microphones were accompanied by armfuls of people wanting to know what was really going on. "This is just a bizarre situation," one reporter commented, standing in front of the crowd. "We're getting reports of police brutality against black people at a wedding, and it's causing anger in the community." As reporters began asking questions, the police felt the pressure mounting. Wedding guests, seeing the cameras, began to raise their voices. "This is racism in action," one of the men shouted. "Look how they treat us just because of the color of our skin." But the neighbors, watching what was happening, did not hold back. One of them, in his heart, shouted, "Don't listen to them. They're just putting on a show. Don't be fooled. You shouldn't believe them." As if frightened by public opinion, the police became even more brutal. one of the officers approached a group of reporters, shouting, "It's none of your business. You shouldn't be here. We're investigating." "You call this an investigation?" one of the reporters asked, holding out his microphone. "What makes you think you have the right to humiliate these people just because of their race? You owe us an explanation for your actions." The guests began to support the reporters by raising their voices. "We're not criminals," one of them shouted. "We just want to celebrate love, not be victims of your stereotypes." Reporters began asking questions of the police, forcing them to give answers about what was happening, but instead of admitting their mistakes, the police only increased their threats. "We can detain anyone who gets in our way," said one of the officers, his voice sounding like a sentence. "You have no right to do this." The groom's uncle shouted again, "You want to arrest us simply because we want to be free? This is racism." Meanwhile, the wedding attracted more attention. Locals began to gather around, wanting to see what was going on. Many supported the guests, condemning the actions of the police and the neighbor. "This is just a disgrace," one spectator shouted. "Why don't the police protect people and instead take the side of the racists?" The neighbor, realizing that the situation was getting out of control, began shouting insults again. "You're all just lying. They shouldn't be here. We need to protect our community from people like them." These words only spurred the protesters on. The guests began to clench their fists, realizing that their only defense now was to support each other and their alliance with the locals. "We've tolerated racism and bias for too long," one guest told the cameras. "We demand respect, and it has to stop now." These words resonated with the audience, and soon cheers were heard all around. People began to condemn the actions of the police and the neighbor, creating a powerful stream of support for the newlyweds. The situation became so tense that the police officers began to look at each other, and uncertainty showed in their eyes. They realized that everything they did was now under public scrutiny, and their behavior could have serious consequences. "We're going to complain about you," one of the men shouted, and his words were met with cries of approval. "This isn't just a wedding. This is a fight for justice." The neighbor, finding no support from anyone, continued to shout his racist slogans, but as the noise around him grew, he began to feel increasingly isolated. He now realized that his hatred and prejudice could no longer go unnoticed. The situation at the wedding began to gain popularity on social networks, and soon the news of the racist incident attracted the attention of not only local but also national media. Reports of the event filled TV screens and online platforms, and soon the entire country learned about the outrage that occurred at the wedding. Gathering in the studio, the news anchors discussed how something like this could happen in modern society. Racism still exists in our society, and here is another example of how bias can lead to violence and humiliation, one of the hosts said sadly, "But we must remember that each of us has the right to celebrate our love without fear or prejudice." Meanwhile, the video of the incident continued to spread, sparking heated discussions on social media. People began sharing their own stories of racism, and soon a wave of solidarity emerged. Under the hashtags #JusticeForTheCouple and #EndRacism, many began demanding answers from local authorities. The neighbor who had once been proud of his behavior was now under fire. Posts with his name and photos began appearing on social media, exposing his bias. Angry comments poured in. "This man must be held accountable for his actions." Many wrote, "We will not tolerate racism." The police, feeling that their actions were being discussed, began to try to justify themselves. One of the officers, sitting in front of the camera, said, "We acted according to our protocols. We cannot ignore suspicious behavior, regardless of race." But his words only added fuel to the fire. The public did not accept his explanations and condemned the actions of the police. "This is just madness," one commentator exclaimed live on air. "They have become instruments of racism, and their actions are unacceptable." Amid this public outcry, prominent public figures and activists began to speak out, calling for talks with local police and discussions on reforms needed to combat racism and bias. "We need to create a space where everyone can feel safe, regardless of the color of their skin," one activist said at a press conference. "This is not just a problem for black people, it's a problem for the whole society." The neighbor, seeing his life crumble before his eyes, tried to justify himself. He began giving interviews, claiming that his intentions were good. "I was just looking out for the safety of our neighborhood," he said. but his words sounded pathetic and unconvincing. The public did not accept his explanation, and his isolation only deepened. Meanwhile, the bride and groom, despite the stress and trauma, became a symbol of resistance and unity. They gave interviews and shared their story, turning their horrific experience into a call for change. "We want this to be a lesson for everyone," they said. "Every person deserves respect and love. We must not allow hatred and prejudice to ruin our lives." With each new report, with each new comment, the public became more and more involved in the fight against racism. People began to gather for rallies, demanding justice and support for victims of racial prejudice. The wedding, originally conceived as a celebration of love, became a turning point in the fight against prejudice and hatred. The community was in an uproar, and all eyes were now on the neighbor and the police. Their actions were under a microscope, and the consequences of their bias were beginning to show on their reputations. Each day brought new calls for justice and new opportunities for change. This incident became a symbol of the fact that no one can remain in the shadows when it comes to fighting racism and bias. There was finally hope that society could change, and every word, every action now mattered. As public outrage mounted, the police department came under pressure. Soon, an official press release appeared on their website, attempting to explain their actions using language that seemed to only fuel the outrage. "We recognize that the situation at the wedding got out of hand and apologize for any inconvenience this may have caused," the statement said. "Our goal is to protect and serve, and we acted according to protocols." However, many took this statement as empty words. People began to question the real reason for calling the police and why their actions were so aggressive. Debates about racism and bias erupted on social media, and it soon became clear that no explanation would be able to cover up the scandal. Discussions about the need for police reform have begun among activists and experts. Amid growing public anger and criticism, interviews have emerged with former and current law enforcement officers who share their views on the system's problems. "This situation is a result of the way we are trained," one former police officer admitted. "We have been trained to see skin color and react to it. It is a bias that we must eradicate." Meanwhile, the bride and groom continued to speak out, becoming the face of the movement for justice. They began holding press conferences to talk about the pain and fear they experienced on that terrible day, as well as the importance of fighting racism. "We can't let things like this happen again," the bride said. "We have to fight for those who can't speak up. This isn't just our story, it's the story of everyone who has ever experienced prejudice." The situation reached a boiling point when a local news report discussed how the officers were trying to minimize the consequences of their behavior. While one officer, under public pressure, began to defend himself, his colleagues looked increasingly unsure. "We were just following orders," he said, but there was panic in his voice. "We didn't mean to hurt anyone." Many noticed that the police response lacked sincerity. The debate about racism and bias was only growing, and it soon became clear that they could not simply sweep the scandal under the rug. The public was demanding change, and those who supported the police began to realize that inaction would no longer be acceptable. People began to gather for rallies, demanding accountability from the police and an investigation. With each new protest, the spirit of unity and solidarity grew. This story about the wedding became a symbol of the fight for justice, and no one was going to stop. New hashtags related to the incident began to appear on social media, and each new post became a step towards change. Even local businesses began to support the movement, posting posters with slogans about equality and solidarity. The police, feeling the pressure mounting, began to voice concerns about the possible consequences of their actions. However, instead of admitting their mistakes, they tried to focus on covering their tracks, which only made the situation worse. The public was no longer ready to give in, and each new step by the police became another reason for discussion. In response to criticism and accusations, they began taking steps to defuse the situation, but instead only attracted more attention. The state governor, realizing that this incident had become a serious issue for his administration, announced an internal investigation. "We need to find out what happened, and if any of our officers broke the law, they need to be held accountable," he said, giving new significance to the publicity surrounding the police action. Yet every step forward for the police has been hotly debated, with the public still angry and determined to see real change. This incident was just the beginning of a fight in which those who are no longer willing to accept prejudice and hatred will have the final say. The situation of the neighbor who called the police on a wedding quickly gained the attention of not only local but also national news outlets. Reports of his racist behavior and hateful comments began to appear everywhere, and the public demanded justice. The neighbor who had previously taken pride in his behavior found himself in the middle of a scandal he could not escape. As new facts about his past began to surface, it became clear that this was not the first time he had engaged in racist behavior. On social media, users began posting videos and testimonies of the neighbor repeatedly demeaning people of another race, making biased comments and insults. The neighbor became a symbol of hatred and bias, and the public could no longer remain indifferent. Along with the activists who demanded his punishment, many residents of the area began to gather outside the neighbor's house to protest his actions. They held signs with slogans like "Hate will not pass," and "We will not remain silent." This atmosphere of indignation only increased the pressure on local authorities to take action. Discussions about the potential legal consequences for the neighbor became increasingly urgent. Lawmakers and advocates began to question whether his behavior could be classified as racial discrimination or even hate speech. Local activists insisted that an investigation should be conducted not only into the neighbor's actions, but also into his previous behavior. Meanwhile, the neighbor began to feel fear and anxiety. He realized that more and more people were judging his actions and that his life would never be the same. While his friends and acquaintances began to distance themselves, the neighbor increasingly locked himself in his home, experiencing the consequences of his decisions. "I just wanted to protect my community," he repeated silently, but the words no longer rang true. He felt his life falling apart, and he knew his actions were wrong. Meanwhile, local authorities began to discuss the possibility of holding the neighbor accountable. Meetings with lawyers began to be held to consider what measures could be taken against him. However, many had doubts. Would he really be punished? The public, filled with anger and a desire for justice, demanded concrete action. Social media lit up with new posts calling for the neighbor to be held accountable and supporting efforts to combat racism. Many expressed their opinions that the neighbor should not only be convicted, but also held criminally responsible for his actions. With each passing day, the pressure on local authorities increased. Activists began organizing rallies and protests demanding justice. They called for the formation of public opinion that would promote stricter punishments for racism and hatred. Meanwhile, the neighbor was increasingly seen on the streets, trying to keep a low profile, but more and more people were pointing and whispering. His life, once filled with pride in his beliefs, was now a source of shame. He felt inside that justice had to be done, but he didn't know if he would be the one to suffer the consequences of his actions. The public was determined to see justice done, and the neighbor wasn't going to be left to live a simple life in the shadows. With each passing day, he became more and more aware that his racist views had led to his complete isolation and possible punishment. The situation was heating up, and soon the moment would come when the neighbor would have to answer for his actions. Now everything depended on whether society could achieve justice or whether his behavior would remain unpunished. In this confrontation between hatred and justice, the public was determined to take control of the situation and do everything possible to ensure that racism did not go unpunished. As the events unfolded, the community that had been shaken by the incident began to experience profound changes. A previously unknown community became united and ready to take action, seeking justice and recognition of its rights. This was a real turning point, not only for the couple who had been humiliated, but for the entire community, which was confronted with issues of racism and bias. The neighbor finally found himself the center of attention, which he did not like at all. He could not leave his house without fear of being recognized or judged. The locals no longer laughed at his antics. Now they began to angrily discuss his actions. Protests broke out in his own yard, demanding that he be held accountable. The public condemnation made him feel that his old life had been destroyed, and he could no longer continue his normal life without consequences. At the same time, the police department, under fire, began to review its procedures and policies. An internal investigation, prompted by public pressure, led to major changes in the way it works with local communities. The police department launched a program to train officers on diversity and inclusion to better understand the needs and rights of citizens. Discussions began about reforming its practices to prevent similar incidents in the future. The voices that emerged from the rallies began to be heard not only in the local community, but also at the government level. The incident attracted the attention of national news outlets. and soon became a topic of discussion in major media outlets. The state governor pledged to support initiatives aimed at combating racism and bias, which further fueled the activism. The couple who survived this horrific incident managed to not only regain their dignity, but also became a symbol of change. They began working with human rights organizations to help others who had been victims of racial bias. Their story inspired many, and they became the face of a movement that fought for the rights of all who had experienced discrimination. Despite all the changes that have taken place, the shadow of the incident remains in people's minds. People have become more critical of their beliefs and views, discussing issues of racism and bias both within their families and in society. The incident has become a lesson for many, making them realize how easily hatred can turn into action and how important it is to confront such manifestations. The neighbor who had been a bully was now an example of how hate can ruin a life. His life had been filled with blame and isolation, and he realized that his once unpunished actions had led to a complete loss of respect and support. The lesson he learned was an important reminder for society: racism and prejudice do not go unpunished. The end of this story was not only a victory for justice, but also the realization that change is possible. Although the path to eradicating hatred is still long, society has become one step closer to unity. Every voice, every action mattered, and no one was going to give up. What started as a horrific incident turned into a platform for change, leaving an indelible mark on people's minds and hearts. Everyone now knew that fighting for equality and justice was not only a right, but also a duty. The incident became part of a larger struggle that everyone continued with renewed strength and determination. Dear viewers, it is very important for us to know your opinion about this story. What do you think about how events are developing? Have you ever experienced racism or bias in your life? Your thoughts and experiences are very important to us, and we value each of you. If you liked the story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like it. It really helps us to develop and create new interesting materials for you. Have a nice day and look forward to seeing your comments.